Doc Holliday, one of the most recognized names in American history. Yes, history and Hollywood have distorted who the real Doc Holliday was. So much was written about him was wrong. Was Doc really the cold-blooded killer that many made him out to be? In his memoirs, Wyatt Earp described Holliday this way. He was a dentist whom necessity had made a gambler, a gentleman whose disease had made him a frontier vagabond, a philosopher whom life had made a caustic wit, a long, lean, ash-blonde fellow, nearly dead with consumption, and at the same time the most skillful gambler and the nerviest, speediest, deadliest man with a six gun I ever knew. Doc's lifelong ambitions were constantly cursed by his future, especially his health. The noted Western writer and historian Bob Bose Bell gives a description of consumption that afflicted John Henry. It would be difficult to better describe it as untreated TB. Consumption can go undetected for some good time, especially if the tendency towards denial is followed. Fatigue is more and more pronounced, and one's appetite seems to disappear. One feels out of sorts and clammy. Periods of fever come and go. One wakes up in the dead of the night, drenched in sweat. In the morning, choking, coughing, and spitting up. At first, watery fluid, later blood and chunks of lung tissue rack the sufferer. The chest feels as if it were imploding, and the pain of it all leads many to alcohol for temporary respite. To crown it all, many thought the illness was a result of moral laxity, compounded with terror and contagion. The consumptive becomes something of a pariah, a lunger, despised in and for his infirmary. Now please welcome David Wright as Dr. John Henry Holliday.
Miss Kate, come on. Thank you, Miss Kendra, and thanks to the Canyon City Public Library and the Steeple Event Center for having me here today. As I look around the room, I must be either dreaming or I've died and gone to heaven. So many beautiful women in front of me. Well,
Doc, I'm going to tell you right now, you keep thinking about those women and you are going to die, and I doubt you will be welcomed at the pearly gates.
Well, what an ugly thing to say to me. Well, I'm sure everyone here at some point in their life, probably every night maybe, dreams. And dreams can be so many different things. They are as individual as the individual. You might dream about having a large, loving family, a nice place to live, perhaps even a decent wage from employment. Dreams can also take you to fantasy lands that don't exist, only in your own mind. But dreams, like everything else, have a yin and a yang, a right and a wrong. They're those kind of dreams that make you sit bolt upright in your bed at night, your heart pounding, your breath short, making you wonder, did I just dream that, or did that really happen? Well, unfortunately, I've had dreams of both kinds, and it seems like those negative dreams have haunted me most of my life. Now, I never dreamed, for example, the path of death and destruction that I have apparently left in my wake as I've traveled through the American West, probably written by some alcohol-soaked purveyor of words who wouldn't let facts get in the way of a good story. They've spelled my name wrong. They've gotten my birth date wrong. They've even gotten my birthplace wrong. So, to set the record straight for any of you taking notes, my full name is Dr. John Henry Holliday, spelled with two L's, DDS, which stands for Doctor of Dental Surgery. I was born August 14th in 1851, though as I mentioned, some have written that I was born in 1852, and I'm sure most of you would agree getting an extra year back was not something that you would actually get angry about. Now, I was born in a little town called Griffin in the youngest of the 13 original colonies, Georgia. At that time, my parents were elated that they now had a son, but they actually had a daughter before I was born. Poor little thing, Martha, she died about 6 months old from diphtheria. But there was also another boy in the house, if you will, a young boy named Francisco Hidalgo. My daddy had found him when he was in the Mexican War in the 1840s. Poor kid was an orphan, so my daddy brought him home to Griffin before he actually married my mama. Now, being the oldest son, or the only son of the oldest son of the family, they were excited that I would be able to pass on the family name with respect and honor. But I had all my 10 fingers and toes, so that part was all right until they inspected a little closer and found out, like a pie that hadn't been fully baked, I wasn't complete. And what I mean by that is I was born with a cleft palate and a split lip that luckily didn't come all the way through to the front. Well, my parents, having lost their daughter, were quite concerned that I would not be able to survive, because with that condition, it was difficult for me to suckle. My uncle, Uncle John, whom I got my first name from, was a noted surgeon out of Fayetteville in Georgia, which was about 20 miles from where we lived. Well, he thought that might be able to be corrected with surgery, but I'd have to gain some weight. Gave me about 2 months before he consulted with a Dr. Crawford Long, who was dabbling in using ether for making you unconscious and not being able to feel any pain. Well, a lot of people thought that was witchcraft, that was just unnatural or was mind control. So a lot of folks were apprehensive to use that type of anesthesia. But my Dr. John consulted with Dr. Crawford Long, and they figured, well, they could repair me in one surgery instead of two. So when that was 2 months, they did indeed perform the surgery. They were able to close the cleft in my part of my roof of my mouth, sewed up the inside of my lip, but it made it still difficult for me to get any type of nourishment. So my mama had to feed me with an eyedropper and my favorite vessel for liquid, a shot glass. Somehow I never got over that habit. But it was a long and arduous task for her. It took about an hour and a half each time, and a lot of times I'd fall asleep while she was trying to feed me. And I'd wake up later and we'd have to start this all over again. Luckily, a lot of ladies from the church came by and helped her so she'd have time off and be able to rest, take care of other family business. Now, I wasn't the only son, if you will, in the family at that time, because my daddy, he brought back an orphan from the war with Mexico in the 1840s, a young man who was about 8 years old at that time, named Francisco Hidalgo. Now, when I was about 2 years old, he actually left, went out on his own. But that didn't mean there weren't kids to play with, for my aunts and uncles would come visit periodically, and they'd bring their children with them. And my favorite, Robert, from my Uncle John, he was about just a year older than me, so we got along real well. My other favorite cousin was Cousin Mattie, and she was one of the 4 daughters of Robert Kennedy Holliday. We always enjoyed playing and having fun, and we'd go occasionally walk out in the woods that were out behind the house when I got older. And out there it was always lovely because there was magnificent magnolia trees and azaleas and honeysuckle vines, and sometimes they were so thick with fragrance it would likely make you sick sometimes. But the ladies, they all bring blossoms They'd bring them home from the magnolia trees and put them in a bowl of water in the middle of a room, and eventually that would make the whole house very fragrant. Now, because of my condition, it was difficult for me to talk, and my mama was always making sure that anyone would not make fun of me while we were together playing. But she kept a little book for me. It had pictures in it of things that were difficult for me to pronounce, because those words that made you put your tongue up on the top of your mouth were very difficult for me to pronounce. But after lots of repetition, I finally was able to start speaking properly without a noticeable lisp of any kind. Plus, the southern drawl helped cover it up a little bit too. Well, I went to school eventually there in Griffin, but my daddy also sold the house that we lived in on Tinsley Street and moved us to a farm outside of town, about a few miles. And that was always an enjoyable place to be, because we were away from the city and the hustle and the bustle that was going on. My daddy was very successful. He had started off as a druggist in town, and eventually he started dabbling in real estate. At one point, he owned about 46 plots of land in town and hundreds of acres outside of town in various parts of Georgia. Most notably, wherever the railroads were projected to be, he bought property down that way because he knew that would increase in value. Now, Daddy was a very strict man. He was a military man, even though he wasn't in the military at this time, but he had served, like I said, in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. So he was a very hard-headed man. He had a hot temper. He demanded that you be polite to your elders, no matter their station in life. Yes, sir, yes, ma'am. No, sir, no, ma'am. No fooling around. You behaved yourself. So they let us have freedom to go out and enjoy ourselves, but they didn't want us to become too feminized, if you will. And he also taught me, like most Southern boys knew at the time, how to be proficient with pistols, rifles, shotguns. Taught me how to go fishing, how to go hunting, how to respect women, how to behave myself in social gatherings. My mama, on the other hand, she was a sweet lady, very, very much devoted to her Catholicism. She also taught me how to play piano while I was growing up, which I thought was a fun thing to do when I had nothing to do. Sit down, play the piano a little bit. She also taught me to respect and enjoy the arts, the great painters and the great composers. Now, everything seemed to have been going pretty smooth as the years progressed toward the 1860s. But words were starting to become hot and heavy about war with the North. Well, eventually it did start in 1861 as South Carolina opened up on Fort Sumner. Well, all the men immediately rushed to join the ranks of the Confederacy, and Georgia was the second state to secede from the Union. Pardon me just a moment. The dust from my trip has made my mouth very dry. I have my favorite liquid here anyway. Pardon me while I indulge for a moment. Well, my daddy and all my uncles and older cousins, they all joined. My daddy, realizing they needed a place to train, sold about 100 acres of our farm to the Confederacy. And that was rather an interesting time, because for young boys like myself, seeing all these young men in their fresh, crisp uniforms and drilling and practicing and shooting, well, we all pretended too when we went out in the woods that we were out there hunting down the bluebellies. And of course, we all figured, well, this isn't going to last real long. Heck, we could even whip them Yankees with corn stalks. Well, we found out later that wasn't really the case. The war was a terrible thing for us. Scott's Anaconda, as it was called, the blockade of the southern ports, squeezed the life out of us slowly. It kept us from getting the basic necessities. It kept us from getting things like shoes, and paper, and ink, and cloth, and other necessities. Thank goodness for the blockade runners, though. They were able to bring in occasionally some goods, but still not enough to sustain us all. So the women had to be very innovative in preparing meals and being able to provide clothes. A lot of times they had to take down their curtains and cut them up for dresses or for shirts or for whatever was needed. Well, my daddy was made a major in the quartermaster corps, and when he went off, I was left to be the man of the house. Luckily, I had been taught how to use a pistol, so my mama felt confident that I would be able to take care of any problems that arose. Luckily, that did not happen. My daddy came back after about only a year of service. He had contracted dysentery that had killed so many other people. But he was a dejected man, a broken man. He realized that Sherman and the Union Army was probably going to set their sights on Atlanta being a major railroad hub. And seeing that we were only about 20 miles from Atlanta, he figured we might be in the way of his path of destruction as he was going to make his way down to Savannah. So my daddy decided, I think we best get down far away from this as we possibly can, and moved us down towards the Florida-Georgia border, a place called Cat Creek outside a little town, ugly little town named Bemis. It obviously had been built with green wood because it was all warped and paint was peeling. It was not very appealing at all to look at. But there in Cat Creek, a lot of our aunts and their children came and lived with us since their husbands had been off, were still off in the war. Well, eventually, Daddy decided that the Yankees were indeed coming, and he had worried because some of the relatives had actually gone to Savannah, hoping they'd be out of the way, and as we know, Savannah was in his sights, Sherman's sights. So eventually they worked their way down to see us in Bemis, and that was nice to finally have family after being ripped away from everything I had known up until I was about 10, 11 years old. I had to leave behind all my friends, left behind my only home I had known at that time. All my surroundings were familiar, and now I was in a whole new place. And that kind of made me withdraw a little bit from enjoying life. Wondered what the heck was going on. Well, eventually, as we know, the war ended. South lost. That again was another, disappointment, should I say. But that wasn't the only big tragedy that I thought we had gone through and were done with. Because after the war, the North imposed Reconstruction upon us, which is kind of a fancy name for military occupation. To add insult to injury, they provided us with soldiers with rifles and bayonets, most of them colored folks. And that, again, was an insult. And just when I thought things could not get any worse, in September of 1866, my mama died. And that was the darkest day of my life. She had been my friend, my confidant, my teacher, my soft place to land from the hard hands and words of my daddy. Now, at that time, you were supposed to mourn at least for a year, if not 2 years. And you were supposed to wear black for the first 9 months and then gray or white thereafter. Well, my daddy, bless his heart, remarried after only 3 months of mourning my mama. 3 months. I could not believe the insult to her memory. Well, to make it even worse, the woman he married was only 8 years older than me. They wanted me to call her mama. I was not about to do such a thing.
Calm down, Doc. Your health. Here, try your medicine.
Oh, well, thank you, Kate. Excuse me a moment. That might help calm me down. I certainly hope so. Though I'm glad you brought enough, darling.
Have another drink if you need it.
I will. That's never a problem. Well, as I said, my daddy remarried that woman, Rachel Martin. And then he decided, well, we're not going to live at Cat's Creek anymore. We're going to go down and live in Valdosta, which was next to Bemis. And that home that he purchased just happened to have been one that was owned by the Martin family itself. So I was constantly reminded about what had transpired, and I hated my daddy even more. Well, the union decided they were going to have what was called the Freedmen's Bureau created to be able to protect the new rights and interests of the black man, which made us more subservient. They took away our rights, they took away land from most people, and gave them to the black folks. You talk about being insulted. Let me tell you right now, we could not believe this was happening to us. Apparently, they wanted to subjugate us so we would be just in their palm of their hands all the time. Well, one day I went out with a couple of friends over to the Withlacoochee River. I always love saying that word, Withlacoochee. It's one of them Creek words. Creek Indians and Cherokee used to live in Georgia, and they got all run off. Well, we went out there one day. We had built this nice little swimming hole there in the creek. Go out there, and lo and behold, there's 3 colored folks out there swimming in our hole. We weren't about to put up with that. I told them, now y'all get on out of here. This is our place. Well, they said, heck no, we ain't going. Make us go. Well, an argument ensued, and I had about enough of it. So I grabbed my pistol that I always carried with me and fired a shot up in the air. Well, need I tell you, they went skedaddling off in a big hurry. Pardon my French. Well, as you know, the old game of pass it on, where you whisper something into one's ear and they pass it on to another one. Eventually it got back to my daddy in town that I had killed one of them boys. Well, considering what was going on with Reconstruction, they figured, I best maybe get out of town for a while. So they sent me up to see my Uncle Robert Kennedy up in where he had moved over to Jonesboro. I stayed with him until things settled down there in Valdosta. But while I was there, my Uncle John, he did come visit. Now, he was a physician, as I mentioned, but now that the war was over, there was a lot of men who claimed to be doctors, and they had snake oil and all kinds of strange remedies that supposedly healed you of everything and anything. Chances are it was all alcohol, and that'd make you blind, crazy, drunk, and you'd probably forget about all your problems. But he said, now, a new physician or a new profession was coming up, and you had to have a license for this one, because a lot of these folks who claimed they were doctors had no license at all. He said, perhaps dentistry would be apropos for you. It would be a good source of income. It would be a respected profession that would be in good standing with the family's reputation. Well, I returned down to Valdosta and discussed that with my daddy, and he thought too, yes, that's probably a good idea, son. So I applied for the School of Dentistry up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, unfortunately, being in Yankee country, I had no choice but to go there anyhow because it was at the time the biggest dental school in the world. Now, you didn't have to go to school all year round. You went to school for a few months, and then you had some time off, and then you'd come back again. And during my time off, I worked with a Dr. Frink there in Valdosta, be able to perfect my skills a little bit better. Went back to school and eventually graduated in 1870. But I was not yet 21. You had to be 21 to get your certificate. So a friend of mine from school, he was going to open an office in St. Louis, Missouri, and said, hey, why don't you come join me for a while and we can have some fun. You can practice your dental skills, and when you finally get to be 21, you'll get your certificate and you'll be on your way. I thought, well, heck, that's a good idea. Now, not too far from where his office was the, shall I say, seedier part of town, which I thought was rather intriguing, and went there and enjoyed those peculiarities of life. Enjoyed company of some women, and of course had myself a few drinks while I was there. But then I finally got my certificate and went back down to Atlanta, where my Uncle John had now moved, being the new capital of Georgia. And we had quite a good time while I was there, because that was where my cousin Robert was, and he was a good-looking boy, and my uncle made sure we were introduced into society, and there was no shortage of women to be in the company with. He also had a mulatto slave called Sophie, and Sophie was real good at playing cards. She couldn't read or write, but she sure enough knew how to play cards, I'll tell you that. A couple of games she taught us were called skinning and up and down the river. And she was really good. She knew how to count cards, and she told us and showed us how to do that ourselves, which came in very handy, unbeknown to me, later in my life. Well, I was able to secure a position with the preeminent dentist in town named Dr. Ford. We hit it off pretty well, but then a recession hit, and our clientele fell off, and our sources of income fell off. Well, I figured, well, I might give myself a hand at going to the other part of town where they had beer halls and dance halls and saloons, and maybe I'll just try my luck out there and playing cards with some of these folks and see if I could win myself some money. Well, being an innocent young man, I didn't realize a lot of folk out there were actually cheating when they were playing cards. I didn't win as much as I figured I might, but I also found it very interesting and at least an alternate source of income. Apparently, Dr. Ford didn't cotton to that too well. We dissolved our partnership, and I opened my own office. But like I said, clients were few and far in between. And eventually I figured, well, I don't think this is going to work too good. Now, I had hoped to perhaps marry my cousin Mattie. And at that time, that was acceptable. Well, she was Catholic, and I wasn't. Still aren't. And no matter if I had taken her faith, making us both Catholic, that was against the rules of the church. And I realized, well, heck, I don't think I'll be able to get married to her. And I don't think she'd want to get married to me, because not too long after working, I started losing weight, and I started getting a nagging cough. So I asked my Uncle John if he would examine me and see what was going on. Turned out I had contracted consumption, same disease that killed my mama. And she only lasted about 3 years. Well, they told me, son, you got about 6 months if you stay here in Georgia. Perhaps you should go out west where the air is drier, because Georgia very hot, muggy, very heavy air, makes it more difficult to breathe. So in September, my family gathered at the train station in Atlanta. My Uncle John gave me a diamond stick pin as a going-away present. And off I went, heading for the end of the track, which was at that time Dallas, Texas. But before I left, it was arranged that I would be able to work with the Dr. Seeger in that town because he had known the family, having been a Georgian himself. Well, I pulled into town and met Dr. Ford, and we hit it off pretty well, and he invited me to definitely be a partner with him, and I could even live in his home with him as well until I found my own place. And we did real good the first year. In fact, we entered the Texas State Fair with 3 exhibits that I had created when I was in school. And lo and behold, we won first place in all 3 of those categories. Got a whopping $5 each for each one of them. Well, unfortunately, my cough got worse and worse. And Dr. Ford figured, well, this is probably not good to have a doctor in the office who's going to be looking down your mouth and all of a sudden start coughing. I didn't think they'd probably appreciate that either. So he politely asked, would you mind if we dissolved our partnership? I said, well, I understand, doctor. I'll go ahead and do that. We parted ways, but I opened my own office there in Dallas. But it also afforded me extra time to pursue my other interests, gambling, playing cards, playing faro, and having learned how to count cards, that came in mighty handy because in faro you'd see what cards were already dealt and you could kind of compute in your mind what cards were left. Consequently, be able to make more intelligent bets. Well, eventually, they changed the rules in town where you could no longer drink and gamble in the same room. Now, you could in the same building, but you'd had to be in 2 different places. You could go drinking in one room, and you could go in the other room and play cards and get belligerent and create a ruckus, just as like you were having a drink in the same room playing cards. I never could figure out how they came up with that. I got myself into trouble a few times, and matter of fact, eventually got banished from Dallas along with 12 others for violating the law. So after leaving Dallas, I wound up in a little place as I drifted further west, a little place called Fort Griffin, Griffin Flats. It was a wild little town. It sat down below a plateau and upon which sat the fort itself. So there was constant people coming and going, and soldiers coming through town, and cowboys, and freighters, and folks running cattle. So it was rather lawless town, but once again, wouldn't you know it, I got busted by the law for drinking and gambling in the same dang room. Fined me $10, and I figured, the heck with this, I'm out of here. I couldn't stand that. How you doing, darling?
Doing well, Doc.
All right.
Do you need another drink of your medicine?
Well,
You sound a little hoarse.
I never turned down a drink, if you pardon me, but well, that's mighty fine. Well, after leaving Fort Griffin, I heard about a place called Deadwood up in South Dakota, and that was a new hot spot for mining and for miners and for great opportunities to perhaps fleece a few of those poor folks out of their gold dust or silver, whatever they had in them. But it was a cold place up there in South Dakota. I just spent the winter up there and decided that was enough for me. And I kept hearing about a place called Las Vegas, New Mexico. And they had therapeutic waters there that perhaps would do me good, for my unfortunate consumption was getting worse and worse as each year went by. So I went down there. It was a nice, quiet little town. I opened an office in what became known as Old Town. But for some reason, I just had traveling feet and couldn't stay in one place too terribly long. And once again, these towns, every time I landed there, they kept changing the law back to that no drinking and gambling in the same dang room. I don't know who these people were that kept coming up with these laws, but obviously they didn't like our kind, and they thought perhaps that would stop some of the violence that was going on, getting too liquored up and then getting crazy and trying to shoot holes in the ceiling, if not in somebody's body. So I left town. Let's see now, where we go next, darling? I forget where the heck
I
we
believe
went.
it was Dodge. No, I'm sorry. It was Fort Griffin.
Fort Griffin.
Back to Fort Griffin.
Yeah, that's true. I went back and forth a few times between Fort Griffin and Las Vegas. And, well, this time in Fort Griffin, I got a job at John Shaughnessy's Beehive Saloon dealing faro. And while I was there, I don't know why I forget all of a sudden, that's where I met my lovely lady, Big Nose Kate. Turns out Big Nose Kate knew the Earps, because she had worked for Bessie Earp, the wife of James Earp, when they lived up north. It was also there where I met this man who has become a lifelong friend. His name is Wyatt Earp. He was in town for a few days, and he was telling me about this place called Dodge. It was now a new up-and-coming town. It was a railroad gone through, and cattle drives were coming up there, and consequently, there'd be a lot of folks up there, and perhaps I would enjoy living there better than in Las Vegas. And luckily, they had not yet passed that crazy law about drinking and gambling at the same time in the same room. So Kate and I decided, well, let's give it a shot. Unfortunately, I couldn't take the railroad all the way there. Part of the way, I had to take a stagecoach. Now, if y'all never been in a stagecoach, let me just demonstrate something to you real quick. Now, why don't you three squinch together real tight? Come on, get squinching real tight. Everybody get together. There you go. And you all in the back, you can do the same thing. Now, imagine if you were turned around facing those three folks. All right, so you're pretty much staring at each other, not too far away. Now, also, you'd have probably no room for your feet because a lot of times there'd be mail bags down there, and you'd have to put your own luggage on your lap. And you hope to heck that at least they took a bath a week ago, for crying out loud. Didn't do any good either to put down the curtains that they had on the windows to keep out the dust, because the dust just came in anyway, and then it made it even hotter inside, and you couldn't even see where you were going. And then you'd get to going, and you'd be like sloshing around like water in a bucket. Lord knows how long that would take. It might take you hours to get to where you needed to be. And by then, hopefully, y'all either got real friendly or, well, we'll just leave it at that. Eventually, I pulled into town. Kate and I got a room at the Dodge House, opened up an office in room number 24, going to practice my dentistry again, even though I knew I had a problem, but I kept hoping that this condition of mine would go away and I'd be able to continue on with my profession. Well, one day I was sitting in the back of the Long Branch Saloon playing faro, and three cowboys came busting through the front doors of the bar, creating a rowdy situation, shooting and yelling and screaming and harassing the other customers that were in there. Next thing I know, Wyatt Earp comes bursting through the doors. They all turned around, aimed their pistols at him. Wyatt thought he was a gunner because they kept goading him. Come on, Wyatt. Go ahead, pull that smoke wagon. Let's see what happens. Well, since he was my good friend, I couldn't let that happen. So I sprang up, grabbed a pistol, walked up behind the leader of the three, pointed my pistol at the back of his head. He turned around to see what was going on, and Wyatt then took his pistol out, buffaloed that man right over the head, knocked him to the ground. The other two gave up right off. Wyatt says, "Doc, I believe you'd saved my life." And that way we became fast friends, even to today. Well, unfortunately, my condition got worse, and for some reason, the atmosphere there in Dodge wasn't real pleasant. So I decided to go back to Las Vegas, where I once again tried to at least take the therapeutic waters and see if that would help me feel better. But that didn't happen. So I eventually went back to Dodge, even though I had an office in Old Town Las Vegas. And then I got word from Bat Masterson that there was a feud going on between two railroads here at Canyon City, the Santa Fe and the Denver and Rio Grande. Well, the Denver and Rio Grande had track, stopped about 3/4 miles outside of town, but Santa Fe, they had track that only went to Pueblo. But they had heard that there was a new big silver mine and silver discoveries up in the Cloud City, known as Leadville. And they both wanted to build tracks up that way. Well, the gorge, as many of you might know, Points has stone walls that go over 1,000 feet tall, and sometimes it bunches down to only about 20, 30 feet wide. There's not enough room for two tracks, let alone one. Well, Santa Fe decided they were going to get the jump. They started laying track at the mouth of the gorge. Denver and Rio Grande, they were, as the old saying goes, a day late and a dollar short. They showed up after we had already started. So they decided, well, heck, we're going to jump ahead and we're going to lay a track further down the line. Well, as you would expect, there was a lot of competition. We had a lot of sabotage, people rolling boulders down onto the tracks, tools being thrown into the creek. Armed men actually built fortifications along some places down in the gorge. Well, I guess this feud had been going on for quite a while, because Bat called and said, "Hey, Doc, I'm getting together an armed posse. We're going down to Pueblo to defend the interests of the Santa Fe Railroad." Well, I thought, well, heck, that'd be a nice diversion. Might get my target practice in. Well, we jumped on the train, came down here to Pueblo, about 30 miles, east of town. Well, the two railroads kept feuding, and they kept trying to leapfrog each other because they wanted to get to that rich lode up there in Leadville. We decided we'd commandeer the telegraph office and the roundhouse there in Pueblo of the Santa Fe Railroad. Matter of fact, we actually went off and went to the armory and borrowed a cannon from them. I don't know if they appreciated that or not, but nonetheless, we had that cannon. Well, things went back and forth in court, and lots of money was being spent, a lot of arguments being said. Eventually, Supreme Court said, well, now y'all, we've decided that the Denver and Rio Grande is going to have the right of way. Well, the folks at Santa Fe, they didn't cotton to that neither, and they figured, the heck with that, we're going to lay our own tracks, even though there's places where it bunched up, and actually had built that hanging bridge that was just wide enough for that one train to get through. Well, eventually, the Supreme Court decided Denver Rio Grande is going to have that right of way, as I said. Santa Fe decided, no, you're not. And they decided, well, we're going to take it back by force. Well, the Denver and Rio Grande, they also had their armed men. And one day they approached us there at the roundhouse and telegraph office, and it was kind of a standoff for a little while, but eventually they busted through the telegraph office. And a couple of our men inside had to jump out the back window. One man, unfortunately, got shot in the back on his way out, and another man got his tooth knocked out. Well, luckily for me, luckily for him, being a dentist, I was able to replace that with a nice shiny gold tooth for him, free of charge, of course. Well, there we are, holed up in the roundhouse, not knowing which side's going to make the first move. Eventually, these two men come forward and they're waving a white flag. I go, well, all right. Bat goes out to talk to them to see what they want. Well, apparently they showed him that the Supreme Court had said, yes, indeed, Denver and Rio Grande has the right of way, and Bat, being an officer of the law, had to agree to apply the law. Came back and told us, boys, it's all over. You don't go home now. Denver and Rio Grande, they got the right of way. Well, as I mentioned, that the Santa Fe decided, the heck with that noise, we're going to build our own tracks. Well, the stockholders and bondholders for the Denver and Rio Grande got nervous that that might interrupt their cash flow. So they said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll lease the track to you for 30 years. Well, we manipulated the prices a little bit, and they got real upset about it and took it back to court, and eventually that was the end of that war that supposedly had happened, though it really wasn't. A few men did get shot, but it wasn't as bad as it was made out to be. So I returned to Las Vegas. Kate was there with me, and I figured, all right, now this is an opportunity for me. I'm not done running around the country. I'm done trying to find a place to live. And Las Vegas was a nice town, quiet town. The new part, I thought, well, this is a nice place. I think I'll build a saloon. Since my dentistry was decaying, if you will. Well, it was a lifelong dream of mine. And lo and behold, yes, got that saloon built and everything was going great for a while. Well, I say for a while because one day this ex-Army scout came busting through, started pestering one of the girls that was working there for me. Wanted her to go with him. She kept saying, no, I'm not going with you. He said, the heck you are. You're coming with me. No, I'm not going, she kept saying. Well, I guess he was liquored up enough, he got PO'd enough, and he decided to heck with this. He ran outside and came back a few minutes later and fired a single shot through the saloon. Well, knowing that wasn't good for business, I grabbed my own pistol, ran out, fired one shot at him, dropped him into the dust. Man died 3 days later. I thought, oh, Lord, here it goes again. I'm going to get in trouble with the law. I think I'll just leave this all behind me. Knowing that Wyatt was in Dodge, I figured, well, let's just go back there, Kate. We know at least what's going on in that town. We know what the laws are. We know our friends are there. And I had enough of this New Mexico business. So we get back there to Dodge. One day, I get a letter because it turned out Wyatt had left. I figured, now wait a minute. He invites me to come to town. I come to town. He's not even there. What kind of host is that? It'd be like inviting you to a party and you show up and the party giver is gone. Well, what are you going to do? Well, he left me a letter and said, Dear Doc, family, which meant his brothers and wives, they were going to go to a new place where silver was being discovered. And it's a nice new town, and they didn't have these absurd laws of drinking and gambling in the same room. And I figured, well, why not? So I said, Kate, I think you best be packing up your stuff, because it looks like we're going to be going down to Arizona territory in this town called Tombstone. Though I did think, well, I hope that doesn't mean anything negative about the town, that maybe it's livelier than Tombstone sounds like it would be. So we gathered up our stuff. So Kate was upset. She's like, Doc, why are you always following this Wyatt Earp? You know I don't like him. I said, well, that's because he's about the only friend I have, darling. So we packed up and headed for Prescott, Arizona. Just so happens that Wyatt was there. He said, hey, Doc, y'all coming down now to Tombstone? I said, well, heck, I'm planning on coming. How about you, darling? She's like, I don't think so, Doc. You know I don't like him. And you, like a little old puppy dog, keep following him around. I think I'll just go over to Globe and open my own business. Because as you might be able to tell, being that hard-headed woman that she is, she didn't like no man telling her what to do, and decided she'd open her own business for the ladies of the evening, for manly entertainment. Or how did you put it at one time, darling? It was, I forget how you expressed it.
Perhaps a house of divine pleasure.
The house of divine pleasure. Well, indeed. So that's my story, ladies and gentlemen. That's how I got from Georgia to eventually Arizona. So I'm sure you all know the rest of the story, Tombstone. But I thought you might appreciate knowing exactly where I came from and what happened to me and why I became the man that I am. Having those demons following me around all my life, it was more than I could take. And consequently, that's why I drank so much. And actually, it was recommended by physicians at that time that alcohol and opium were the best cures. Well, not necessarily cures, but the best way to suppress your consumption. Well, people claim I'd been a drunk. Well, I assure you that's not true, because if I was drunk most of the time, like they say I have been, I would not be able to be proficient with my pistol or my knife, which I carried with me, and pardon the expression, ladies, but it was called the hell bitch. And I did happen to change the appearance of a few folks with my knife. But anyway, that Civil War, my mama dying, my contract in consumption, my inability to marry the woman that I loved so much, my cousin Maddie, my businesses falling apart. It surely has been a nightmare most of my life so far. I hope to heck that perhaps my next dream will indeed come true, and I'll be able to get rid of my consumption and be able to go back home to Georgia, because now I was a black sheep. I had no profession. I'd been a stain on the family name if I came back, not been able to work. Only thing I could do is play cards and drink. Well, that would not be a good way to, what would I say, a good way to keep the family name in high esteem. So, well, I think we better get going, darling. I feel a little feverish, and I might need to lay down for a little bit.
Well, take your medicine first, Doc, and then we shall ride out.
Oh, all right. So I bid you all then a farewell and adieu, and I hope I didn't bore you to tears. I didn't see anybody crying in their hankies, but then again, my vision was a little blurred. Lord have mercy what that noise is.
Friction.
And I hope they ain't trying to bust through the back door to get me again. But I'd be happy to entertain any questions y'all might have. Depending on what they are, of course, I'll answer or not.
Doc, where in Las Vegas did you build your saloon?
It was called Newtown. It was just near the railroad tracks, like I mentioned it. When they built the train tracks, they missed the old part of town, original Las Vegas. And we opened, it was a new part that they called Newtown. How clever. I see a waving hand over here.
Hi, Doc. Is this on? So, if I recollect, you didn't kill the first man that you killed till you were in New Mexico, 1879. Is that true?
Man, that was Mike Gordon,
An Army Scout?
Army Scout, yes, sir. Though I did have an altercation with a man prior to that named Henry Kahn, over in Breckenridge, Texas. We got into a fierce argument, and I had my cane with me at the time, and I decided, well, I'll just show you a little respect, cane the heck out of that man. Well, I aggravated him, I guess, enough where he came back a little while later with a pistol, and I was unarmed, and he shot me. And that's where the word got back to Georgia that I had been killed. They sent my cousin George out to bring me home, but then realized I was still alive. At least I do believe so. And that's when he went back on home to Georgia. So these rumors of me killing 16, 20 men throughout my rampage in the frontier of the American West are totally untrue. It was really Mr. Gordon met his demise in my hands on one or two other folks, as history will show later than it is right now. Yes, ma'am.
What year did you wind up going to Glenwood Springs?
Say that again, please.
What year did you wind up going to Glenwood Springs?
Glenwood Springs, I was there, well, in case you didn't know, I died in 1887. At least I think I did. I haven't gotten that far in my life yet, but just to step out of my character for a moment. Yes, 1887, I'd been in Glenwood Springs. Not real long. I'd been there, maybe no more than a year or so. I'd come down from Leadville. Leadville, as we all probably know, the air is like super thin up there. Makes it real hard to breathe, especially when your lungs are slowly deteriorating. And that's part of the problem with consumption, is you can't ignore the pain like you can perhaps on your hand or your knee, because you have to breathe. You have to breathe all the time, and every time you breathe, that hurts. And you get these strange nodules that form in your lungs and in your throat. And that even makes it worse. And sometimes it gets bad enough that when you start coughing too much, you start kicking up blood, parts of your lungs as well. I know that's very appetizing to hear, but that's about the way it goes. Yes, ma'am, anybody else? I see a hand over here. Here comes a microphone.
What took you to Glenwood Springs?
Excuse me?
What took you to Glenwood Springs?
Well, first of all, it was lower altitude, and that helped a whole bunch. But they had vapor caves there, and the vapor caves were supposed to help you. But I don't think that was the case. It seemed to hasten my demise. Now, some folks think it was because of the hot springs, but no, it wasn't the hot springs. They weren't there yet as far as the baths and whatnot. It was just the vapor caves, and vapor cave number 2 was one of my favorites. But it hastened my demise, so I don't know why I'd call it my favorite. Anyone else? Come on now, y'all must have something.
Could you speak a little bit more about your relationship with your cousin Maddie? I understand that you communicated through letters for the rest of your life and that she became a nun?
Yes, my cousin Maddie, like I said, she was my apple of my eye. I was really hoping to marry her, but like I said, since she was Catholic and I wasn't, that just wasn't going to happen. So we kept corresponding for about, I forget how many years, and eventually, I believe it was around 1883, she actually went into a convent, became a nun. Now, as history has it, that she had kept all the letters that I had written to her, but eventually when she died, most of those letters were destroyed. Consequently, nobody really knows for sure what I wrote to her, and I'm about not to indulge you all with that anyway. How we doing? Yes, ma'am.
Johnny Ringo?
Yes, sir. Excuse me.
Did you kill Johnny Ringo?
No, that's a great unknown, actually. It's strange about Ringo, the way he was found with his belt upside down and his pistol caught in his watch chain and slumped up against a tree like that. No, I had nothing to do with it. I was not even in the territory at the time. All right. Thank you so much.